Welcome to the On-Premise IT Podcast, the only show that dares to be both on topic or on premise, and sometimes on location or on premises. Each time we meet, we bring together a group of IT experts to discuss a single idea or premise. On today's episode, which coincides with the launch of our new Utilizing Edge podcast, we're talking about the edge. And basically, the idea here is that we want to dive into the edge in reality. The edge is a real place. It's a real thing. It's really part of IT. But what really is it? Before we get into that, let's quickly meet who's on the panel today.
Hi, my name's Andy Banta, longtime storage industry person, VMware, Sun, NetApp. I believe I was invited to this podcast because I'm edgy.
Hi, and I am Jim Jones. I'm a senior product infrastructure architect for Level 11 Systems, and I believe that I was invited to this because I'm far less edgy.
Hi, I'm Gina Rosenthal. I'm the CEO and founder of Digital Sunshine Solutions, and I think I was invited to this podcast because Stephen likes me.
You know, you're right about that, Gina. And I'm Stephen Foskett, organizer of Tech Field Day and publisher of Gestalt IT. And I ran the Edge Field Day, and I'm also the co-host of the Utilizing Tech podcast. And as I mentioned, we're focusing on Edge this season. So that launched yesterday, April 24th. That podcast is really a deep dive into edge IT infrastructure, from compute, networking, storage, management, orchestration, all sorts of edge solutions. But what I thought was, what if we talk about this topic with people who aren't deeply enmeshed in that space? You know, and I guess I'll kick it off here by just sort of asking you, before I say anything, before I do, before we really dive in here, if I say edge, what do you think of? So just tell me, describe the environment that is edge. And Jim, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so hopping in before Andy comes with a correct answer. From my point of view, I tend to think of edge as anytime we need any other kind of those kinds of resources close to a thing, to a widget. To me, the old example is you've got the irrigation farmer that has the 3,000 sensors out in his field. You need to have something that sits close to that acts as a go-between between that and your bigger resources, what you will, whether they be in a data center or they be in the hyperscaler cloud.
Well, my take on it isn't a whole lot different than Jim's. My take on it is that edge is anything from the perimeter of your data center, your central processing, all the way out to where it falls off the edge of the earth. So I consider edge not just the connection point between the computing and data center resources, but also everything that reaches right out to the edge. So like the irrigation sensors that Jim mentioned would actually be part of the edge. So the edge would be from the perimeter of the main network all the way out to, as I said, where you fall off the edge of the earth.
I think the edge is everything y'all said, plus a little more. It's infrastructure. It's infrastructure, not like we've known it to be infrastructure, just like the mainframe guys didn't understand infrastructure when the new wave of client server came out. But this is the digital transformation. This is what we're ending up with as part of the infrastructure. Whatever workload needs to be in that place. You guys talked about fields before it drops off the edge of the earth. Whatever is needed to run a workload to do a thing, that's the infrastructure for it is edge.
So let's have a quick lightning round here. I want to go around. I'm going to ask you all. We're going to play Is It Edge? Okay. So let's start with this thing. I think you guys have seen one of these. It's an iPhone. Is it edge? Yes, no. Come on off mute and tell me quickly what it is.
You could repurpose a phone and just put a Linux operating system on it, like very lightweight, and maybe you could send an application to do a thing.
I think it depends on your perspective. If you're a cloud provider or a service provider, it's an edge device. If you're an end user consumer, it's a object that's in your network.
Yeah, and from my point of view, it's a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. So it's either a client application, it's a client device, much think of like a thin client, what we used to see before for Facebook or, any other type thing we think of. But at the same time, my handy dandy diabetes sensor on my arm, it's that conduit from that to actually having analytics and data that then lives somewhere else.
All right. How about the thing on the other end of this, the 5G tower and the 5G base station? Is that edge?
Again, I'll go. It depends because that actually would be again the edge of the service provider, the communication network. So that kind of meshes with what I was thinking of originally as edge. That's not part of the service provider's cloud. That is part of connectivity to the device. And again, from the consumer point of view, it's different. That's just your network connection.
Yeah, Andy, I mean, that really brings up a good point for me because I'm kind of fleshing this out a little bit. And now it makes me kind of think of it, is edge more like a thing or a place that exists in a physical device or in a physical location? Or is it more like a place on, think of the old OSI reference model? Is edge one of those things that as we start thinking about monitoring and analytics, is it like a layer in that part that yeah, it may be this network device, but as we go upstream inside of that same location, inside of that same device, as it does these other types of operations like many modern things do, does it become edgier, if you will?
I'm leaning towards, well, 5G as far as the tower, I'm leaning towards no, because 5G is a network transport system. Now, if the towers had some compute that they did there, like pre-compute for, maybe they allow stuff, I don't know what's at the bottom of those towers, but maybe they allow some compute there. I think edge has to be, it's doing something the same as the normal operation stack and not just the network stack, right? So it's either collecting data and sending it, or it's storing data, or it's doing some pre-compute on that particular area, that physical location. I think edge is a physical location.
My question is, does edge actually have to be compute? I mean, if we go back to the original idea of edge routing is again the periphery of what you're doing, and while the routers actually yes do some computing, they're not actually you know edge. They're not devices that actually do compute type resources, and that's exactly where I see the 5G tower. It's essentially a big edge router in the service provider's network.
I think that's why I'm saying it though. I don't think just the compute or just the networking or just storage itself is edge, because I think that's kind of the building blocks of getting to an edge location is having all of it.
And I guess on that note too, when you say edge, yeah, Andy, a lot of people, to your point, think of things like SD-WAN. They think of things like Akamai and Cloudflare and caching at the edge. And again, I guess, do you guys consider those things edge? It sounds like some of you do.
I would say that many of your edge use cases, as they like to get marketed today, are involved in an Intel NUC. It seems like every advertisement I've seen for enterprise edge, it has a NUC involved.
I was again going to give the "it depends" answer because again, just like Jim says, enterprises are using NUCs as edge devices. They're capable of doing low-level compute exercises and some storage, and basically store and forward if necessary. There's also people who might actually be on this podcast who have built their entire home data center out of NUCs. So it's, I mean, that is entirely an application dependent view of it. If you just have a NUC there that's hooked up to your weather station or whatever, I would consider that edge. And if you are using it to do your home file services, that doesn't really approach me as being edge.
I agree. I agree with it. I think it is based on Sorry. I think it is based on the application, whether or not a device and the architecture itself is edge.
Well, one thing I'll let you guys know is this is in fact the most common edge server out there. Basically, most edge infrastructure is built on in a whole world of Intel NUCs. But actually, what I'm getting at with this question is that frankly, all these things are edge, because I'm not the edge police, but also because a lot of them do have aspects of what we're talking about, whether it's software-defined networking, whether it's caching, whether it's, as Andy brought up, the fact that you're doing smart networking applications that aren't necessarily compute applications, whether you're doing mobile devices, WebAssembly, all of these things are edge as well as IoT. And I think that that's one of the more interesting aspects of this. From a data center person or from a cloud person, I think what you'd find is that the technologies are recognizable, but the use of those technologies is what makes it different.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the uses that I've been thinking quite a lot about here lately as someone who kind of focuses on the backup and disaster recovery world is frankly customers and data center people don't want to care about BCDR themselves anymore. They want that thing to happen and they still want to have that on-prem copy of their backups or their replicas and things like that, but they don't want to care about it. So as a service provider, one of those considerations that, I tend to think about is we're looking at devices now to extend storage into, somebody else's network, but that we manage and own. And so to me, that then becomes this data center thing is now an edge thing. It's to quote Andy over and over again, it depends.
And I don't disagree with that, although I tend to think of BCDR appliances as being part of the core of the data center, whether they connect out to the cloud or not. And I was just hoping that Stephen had more show and tell.
Well, I want to say something real quick about the backup stuff, right? So like if you are talking about something that is not just a data center type application or workload that you're looking to protect with this kind of setup, if you are running true edge things like in the field like we talked about or on the tower like we talked about, you're probably going to have a different way of backing those up, and that would in itself be an edge application to protect the data that's either being gathered or worked on or whatever, if that's even something that's desired. At least there's going to be a different way of thinking about all of the things, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely. And I think that that's really sharp, Gina, because what you're hitting on there, I think, is what I learned when diving into this subject is it really is, like I said, it's recognizable to data center IT people. It's recognizable to cloud people, but it's different. And you have to ask these questions. You have to ask these fundamental questions like Gina is asking. Do we want data protection? Do we want high availability? Do we want redundant power supplies? Do we want all of these things that we have come to take for granted in the enterprise? Because you can probably have them. I'll tell you right now, just cheater answer. There are amazing things, including sealed, temperature controlled rack units that you can buy and deploy like literally anywhere on the globe, and you can put any enterprise server in there, storage, switches, whatever you want, and the thing's got its own environmentals and its own power conditioning and everything, and it just sort of freaking runs. You can run data center applications there. Similarly, in many cases, edge is a whole lot of IoT and a lot of little sensors and cameras and stuff, and that works too. But it really all comes down to asking that fundamental question: which services do we need? How are we going to deal with outages? How are we going to deal with upgrades? How are we going to deal with kind of rolling things out? All the same questions that we have as enterprise tech people, but you have to look at them with fresh eyes.
I think one thing that really struck me from Edge Field Day is, what do you do if somebody just flat out steals it? Whatever you're using to compute, or they're small enough they can be. All those NUCs are small enough I could put it in a purse and walk off with it, right? And then I think about maybe another example was the Chinese spy balloon edge location, right? So what happens if is because there's a lot of military uses for edge technologies. So how much data do you want sitting there? And if you have to shoot it down or somebody shoots it down, how do you wipe the data really quick to make, because they were given like hints when they were talking about the spy balloon. I was like, how did they do it? What did they do? So like if you've got sensitive information, so if somebody walks with the data, if it's in a very very sensitive security location, how do you got to think about what's on there and how much you keep and how long it takes to get off and what you can do to blow it up so that nobody can get to that data.
Right, and this actually plays into exactly one of the things that I was going to comment on based on Stephen's comment. I think the redundant power supplies and that type of thing is probably starts disqualifying things as edge. A couple things going to Gina's point. I think one of the key things that we should think about in terms of edge is that if you disconnect it from the edge, the thing should be a brick. It should be useless. And the other point that I was going to make to Stephen's comment was that take a look at a modern car. You have hundreds of different sensors in it. If you actually lose one or two of those sensors, it will tell you that you've lost one or two of those sensors, but it will continue to run. So I think that, part of the concept with edge devices should be that they're useful and they're collecting valuable information, but losing any one of them shouldn't be catastrophic to your business.
Yeah, but Andy, from a the definition of a brick, if you will, there's the definition of a brick where the device is actually stateless itself. It's effectively it does what it does. It then processes the data, sends it somewhere elsewhere. But if it powers down, it has nothing on it. Do we consider it all the way to that line, or do I get to the same place by taking a modern security stance and making sure that anything that's ever that's in flight or at rest is encrypted? That that effectively, yes, it's still a brick, but it's a brick full of little ones and zeros that mean nothing to anybody.
And that's kind of what I meant. That basically, if you have your core feeding key information to the edge at any given time, as soon as you disconnect it from the core, the keys are no longer valid, and it's a brick. And it's like self-encrypting drives. If you don't actually have the key, there's no valuable information there.
Yeah, one of the things that Brian Chambers talked about at the Scale Computing presentation was so this guy we call NUC, Next Unit of Computing. He talked about the idea of a DUC, disposable unit of computing, and that really fundamentally is how most edge environments consider hardware. It's not that it's manageable or highly available or reliable or whatever. It is disposable. It is, we deploy it, we plug it in, it works. As long as it's working, it's good. And when it's not working, it is done. And in many ways, this reminded me of the cloud, where you hear about those data centers where they let the hard drive die, let it sit. I'm not going to replace it. It's not a highly available architecture. It's a different mindset. And that's how it is here too. And I'm really glad that you guys are zooming in on the security question as well, because like Gina said, this is a real thing. A lot of this stuff is deployed in retail, in quick service restaurants, in automobiles, in industrial settings where this stuff can just up and walk away overnight. And you got to be careful about that. Similarly, things can get plugged in. So you have to consider root of trust, and you have to consider, what is going to be used. Same thing comes with networking and so on. You have to think about, who's going to be using that network, what data is going to be on that network as well. There have been high profile security breaches over edge at retail, especially where people plug something into the retail, Ethernet jack and find that they can see credit card transactions, or they can see, the corporate database or something like that. So you got to keep that kind of security in mind too. So it's a whole different world.
I don't think it's really a whole different world, right? So I think all of the principles of how to architect a thing, an infrastructure that an application can run on, are the same. these applications are different. They're probably going to be built with containers and a container management system. And it just is important for architecture people, infrastructure people, to understand what the developers are trying to build. What's that workload look like? And these are the options. If you don't want the data to stay on it, we can do ABC. If it's going to need to be a brick, we can do ABC. So it's important to understand the hardware available for the infrastructures, but it's also important to understand that these are still it's just a workload with a different type of architecture. And everything we've always learned to do, we need to take those and build on it for the edge architectures. It's not like a brand new piece of computing. It's just a step up.
Thank you, Gina, because you're right that there are so many similarities between what's happening there and what's happening remotely. So as Gina said, when we were at Edge Field Day, we heard a lot about Kubernetes. We heard a lot about containers and virtual machines. We heard a lot about storage, and many of the topics were very similar. But the way those things are used is so incredibly difficult or different. I want to see Jim's head explode when I say this next sentence. So one of the ways that people are deploying at the edge is a single node Kubernetes cluster.
Oh, no. I mean, I guess actually, I say that, but that's a valid use case. I mean, the reality of it is you're using it as a conduit, and that's really, kind of tying this all together is, quote unquote, what's edge? Well, it's that thing that you use that's kind of like the stretchy thing that goes out from your data center, that the further out from your data center you get, the more secure you've got to be around the edge of it, because it's going to snap back by way of data, and then also in institutional controls to kind of keep it a good, safe, secure thing. But when it does invariably snap, when that ball at the end snaps the rubber band that's tying it back, shoot, I lost that thing, but it's not the end of the world. I agree with that, with Gina's point on that.
And my take on having the single container in your edge is basically you've taken Kubernetes as a deployment method without any real regard to using it as a clustered system. And when you first mentioned this, Stephen, the first thing that crossed my mind is, wow, somebody's trying as hard as they can to find an actual real use case for Kubernetes.
Yeah, that's right, Andy. They're using Kubernetes because Kubernetes is just, containers are great. Kubernetes is a great way to abstract, orchestrate, define, and deploy containers. And so why not use it in a way completely different from how it was intended? And then we'll also see crazy situations where Kubernetes is actually used to deploy not a single node, but a massive multi-site kind of Kubernetes configuration where you have devices all over the place that are all coordinated in the same cluster. So it really varies.
So I'm not defending this at all, but if that's what they use for their entire enterprise is Kubernetes, and they're also using it on whatever the home base is, maybe that's the reason that they're using it, because they don't know how to deploy a different way. But I mean, you have to have some management system to deploy. They're probably using IAC, where they're reusing the code and they're pulling it from a pipeline. That's really the only way I think that some of these edge locations, this edge stuff can work in very far off locations that need to be updated and patched and given a new version of the application, whatever, is you have to run the infrastructure as code in a CI/CD pipeline. So you just push deploy and it goes to all 500 restaurants that you're sending it off to, or whatever you're doing. So maybe it's just that's what they're using as their deployment method for containers, because you could just as easily use Docker or homegrown or whatever. But that it might sound pretty bad, but maybe it's not bad if that's what they're doing. It's just they're trying to keep it all coordinated.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what it all boils down to is, I mean, we think about edge, we think about things, like to your point, the duck, the disposable unit of infrastructure or knowledge, or whatever acronym you want to use for it. It's you want to be able to do the thing the way that you're doing all the other things that you're doing, and make it to where it's an extension of what you're doing. What's the rationale? What's the reason why we're doing edge? We want to lower latency. We want to lower, the distance between that and whatever thing, and when you get to the end of the day, you don't want to have to do a thing, but this isn't an artisanal snowflake that we then want to take care of. So absolutely, I mean, in that case, it makes absolute sense.
Yeah, it really is like the cloud in that, the pets versus cattle discussion. You cannot have pets at the edge. You cannot have a pet that lives in each of 1,500 retail stores or on a satellite around Mars. That pet, you cannot take control. You cannot take care of him. You've got to have it be something even beyond cattle. And I think that's that's exactly the attitude that they're having here. So given all of this, I guess as we're kind of coming to the end here, think about the creative ideas that you might have from your own background, and think about the ways that you could think of things that might apply in this environment. So, we've heard some great ones. Gina, thank you for mentioning infrastructure as code. Absolutely. That is a huge topic in Edge, because you have to have these things that can be zero touch, rolled out, configured, managed, maintained. Jim, you talked about, this idea of massive scale deployment, and how do you configure these things? How do you keep them up to date? Things like Ansible or Terraform or something like that. Sort of the next level. Andy, I know you've got this incredible background on storage. Tell us, what do you think could be brought from the data center or the cloud to this kind of environment?
Well, I think I touched on some of it already. The idea that if you actually are interested in security, you can use a distributed key setup and make sure that your edge stays secure and unusable if it's not connected. The other pieces are the idea of redundancy of data, where in lots of cloud environments or in lots of enterprise environments, you have the same bits of data copied all over the place, so it's never really lost if you try to touch one place. I with lots of networking background as well. I mean, I see an awful lot of the way that if you treat these as the old style edge network devices and whatever that, or use the same concept of edge computing as you did edge networking, a lot of the same analogies apply.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, Andy, I run my house here off of Meraki Go hardware, and it's it's a brick. If I unplug it, it's going to do absolutely nothing. It's going to be useless. I plug it back in, and poof, the wireless works, and the pipes and tubes are advancing. So thank goodness for Edge and the wonders that it's bringing us.
I can think about like education things, because there's all sorts of military and industrial uses that we're going to see more and more of. But I think it's also important that everyone knows how all of this stuff works. So some of the farm stuff, could you not bring that to an elementary school or a middle school for the gardens that they have, and teach them more about weather? Because then they can actually draw from bigger services to maybe bring those down and do something interesting for their little garden, or just creators being able to use different things. You see that happening already. But I think as things get more and more genericized in this new place that we're in with computing, it becomes really important for just normal people to know how to take an old one of these and turn it into an edge device and do something really cool with it.
Yeah, it is interesting to see the creative ways that people are deploying kind of low-end hardware too, and consumer-grade devices. I mean, in a way, it reminds me of the IoT revolution, which was predicated on all the development that went into smartphones. If there hadn't been smartphones, there wouldn't be IoT. But since there are, we've got all these low-powered, ubiquitous devices that we can build. And it's the same with this. I think a lot of edge environments are using some pretty low-end consumer-grade stuff, and it makes it affordable. It makes it low power. It makes it, honestly, I don't want to say rugged, but maybe adaptable to adverse environments that you might find in, behind your television or underneath the counter at a store. And a lot of that stuff I think is appearing in here as well. So yeah, it really is an exciting topic. And it's been interesting for me to see all of these ideas and all of these familiar concepts just being used in a completely different way. So I guess to wrap up, let's get back to our premise quickly, and we'll go around the table. The edge is a place. Is it a place or is it a concept? Let's start with Gina. Is the edge a place, or is the edge how you're using it?
Yes. I mean, I think it is a physical place because there's infrastructure involved, but I also think that it's not just any, flung out using, little tiny devices thing. It actually is application driven and workload driven.
I personally think it's more of a concept.
I agree that it's a concept in terms of if you're looking at it from an enterprise perspective or a service provider perspective, it's a place. But in general, it's a concept.
Well, I guess all I can say is if you're interested in the concept, if you're interested in the place, and if you're interested in learning more, do tune in Mondays for Utilizing Edge, the 5th season of Utilizing Tech. We've got some great companies, we've got some great technologies, and some great folks from the Tech Field Day delegate community there joining us as co-hosts to discuss this concept. And of course, if you are with me on this premise, then please do tune in again for the On-Premise IT podcast every Tuesday. So before we go, thank you very much for joining us for this discussion. Thanks for weighing in, and thanks for using your creativity here. Where can we continue this conversation with you, Andy?
You can find me on Twitter at Andy Banta. I'm participating in LinkedIn a little bit more these days, and I just started a new blog, andybanta.substack.com.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to find me at, start at koolaid.info and branch out from there to Kool-Aid IT at anything social.
And you can find me at gminx at mass.to on Mastodon, or you can follow us at digitalsunshinesolutions.com or also Digital Sunshine Solutions on LinkedIn.
And as for me, as I mentioned, you can hear me on the Utilizing Tech podcast every Monday, On-Premise IT on Tuesdays, and the Gestalt IT Rundown on Wednesdays. Also, I'm very excited to be over there on the Mastodon as well. You can find me Foskett at techfieldday.net. You can also find me a lot more on LinkedIn these days as well. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed the discussion, please do give us a subscription in your favorite podcast application. Give us a rating. You can find this podcast as well on YouTube. Just go to YouTube/Gestalt IT video, and we'd love to see you there. This podcast is brought to you by GestaltIT.com, your home for IT coverage from across the enterprise. For show notes for this episode and for more episodes, go to GestaltIT.com/podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.